The throne room of the Zarynth Empire glittered with gold and crystal, its high arches reaching into a sky no human had ever seen. Thousands of alien courtiers whispered among themselves as the Empress entered, her long red hair flowing like a banner of fire. She was young but carried herself with the calm power of someone born to rule. At her side, walking in chains, was a human man unlike any they had seen. He was called Kale, taken from a battlefield far beyond Zarynth space. His capture had been an accident, the result of the skirmish with a raiding force that had stumbled into human territory. When the Empress first saw him, she thought of him as nothing more than a curiosity. Humans were rare in the galaxy, spoken of in rumors, their homeworld hidden and unmarked on most star maps. Yet here was one standing before her, silent but with eyes that met hers without fear. The court saw him as an exotic pet, a living prize to amuse their ruler. The Empress had ordered him to be brought to her chambers, where she questioned him for hours. He answered little, but she noticed something in him, a quiet strength, a loyalty that did not seem tied to her yet. She could not understand it then. But she knew this man was no ordinary captive. Days turned into weeks, and Kale was kept close to her. Guards mocked him, calling him an animal from a primitive world, but he never reacted with anger. He simply watched, learned, and remembered. The Empress began to let him walk without chains, trusting him in ways she could not explain. He followed her to councils, battles, and even to the private gardens where only her most trusted attendants were allowed. Then came the day the Empire's stability cracked. A rival claimant to the throne, the warlord Mirek, marched into the capital with an army at his back. He accused the Empress of weakness, of wasting her rule on sentiment and strange pets. The court trembled as Mirek demanded single combat. For the throne, a challenge no ruler could refuse. The Empress was skilled, but Mirek was a seasoned killer. Whispers in the hall said she would not survive. That was when Kale stepped forward. Before anyone could stop him, he walked to the center of the throne room and pointed directly at Mirek. His voice carried across the chamber, firm and unshaken. "If you want her throne," he said, "you will have to go through me." Gasps rippled through the audience, for no human had ever challenged a galactic warlord in their own court. The Empress stared at him in shock. This was not a duel he was allowed to fight. The challenge was meant for her, and accepting it was to break every rule of the Empire. Yet Kale did not wait for permission. His loyalty burned brighter than the golden walls around them, and the court felt it like a sudden change in the air. Mirek laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Kale's eyes did not waver. Something passed between the Empress and her human in. That moment, she saw that he was not acting for glory, nor for himself. He was standing for her because he had chosen to. And in that choice, she realized the danger of human loyalty. It was not the loyalty of slaves or soldiers. It was the loyalty of someone who would defy an entire empire, if it meant protecting the one they had decided to stand beside. The court was frozen in silence, waiting for the Empress to order his execution or to banish him. Instead, she rose from her throne, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "If he fights for me," she said, "then he fights as my champion." The lawkeepers shouted protests, but she silenced them with a single raised hand. The challenge was accepted, and the fate of the Empire shifted in that breath. The announcement spread through the capital like fire in dry grass. A human would fight for the throne of the Zarynth Empire. Many called it madness. Others whispered that it was a trick, a distraction to let the Empress escape if she lost. No one believed that a lone human could stand against a warlord who had slain dozens in single combat. Kale did not waste time explaining himself. The Empress had given him the right to fight, and he accepted it without hesitation. The arena was prepared within hours. Word of the duel reached every district, drawing crowds from across the city. The marble stands filled with alien nobles, Warriors and merchants eager to see a human meet his end. The warlord Mirek arrived first, his armor glistening like molten silver, each plate marked with the names of his fallen enemies. He carried a weapon unlike anything Kale had seen, a long curved blade humming with deadly energy. Mirek smirked as Kale stepped into the arena wearing no armor, only simple clothes, and carrying a short blade made for a smaller species. The crowd, it looked like a slaughter before it began. The Empress sat in her high seat, her hands folded in front of her. Outwardly she appeared calm, but inside she felt something she could not name. Kale had no claim to her throne, no duty to fight for her, and yet here he was. Mirek's eyes flicked toward her before the fight began, as if already savoring victory. The horn sounded and the duel began. Mirek struck first, moving with speed and strength that would overwhelm most warriors. Kale ducked under the first blow, sidestepped the second, and let the third pass by with only inches to spare. He moved like water, never meeting force with force, always redirecting it. The crowd's laughter turned to uneasy murmurs as they realized he was not being lucky, he was reading Mirek's movements before they happened. When Kale finally struck, it was quick and precise. A shallow cut along Mirek's arm drew a hiss from the warlord. It was not a wound to kill, but it was a message. The human was not here to die quietly. Mirek's attacks grew more brutal, but his anger made him reckless. Kale used that, guiding the fight like a hunter guiding prey into a trap. The Empress watched with sharp eyes, noting every shift in Kale's stance. She had fought many battles herself, but she had never seen this style. It was not the rigid discipline of soldiers or the wild fury of gladiators. It was survival sharpened into skill, the kind that came from living on a world where losing meant death. She began to understand why he had stepped forward in her defense. Minutes passed, and Mirek's confidence began to falter. The crowd sensed it too. Every time he swung, Kale was there, not where the blow landed, but already moving to where Mirek's next strike would come from. Then Kale made his move. He feinted to the left, drawing Mirek into an overextended strike, and in that instant, Kale's blade pressed against the warlord's throat. The arena fell silent. Mirek froze, his chest heaving. One push would end him. Kale did not move for several breaths, then stepped back, lowering his weapon. It was not mercy, it was defiance. He had beaten Mirek and let him live, a humiliation far worse than death in the eyes of the court. Mirek staggered back, his expression a mask of fury and disbelief. The Empress rose from her seat, her voice carrying over the hushed arena. The duel is over. The throne remains mine. And this human is under my protection. The declaration was not only to Mirek, but to the entire empire. It was a warning. No one would touch him without facing her wrath. And in that moment, the human who had arrived as a chained captive became the most dangerous ally the Zarynth throne had ever known. The duel had ended, but the storm it unleashed was only beginning. Mirek left the arena without another word, yet his silence was more dangerous than a threat. Those loyal to him would not forget the humiliation. They would speak of it in the shadows, twisting the tale until it grew into a blade aimed at the Empress and the human who had stood in her defense. Kale was escorted back to the royal quarters, no longer in chains but under the eyes of guards who did not trust him. He felt their stares, their unease at his presence. To them, he was not a hero. He was a disruption, a reminder that power could come from outside their rigid traditions. The Empress met him in the private chamber, her expression calm but her eyes studying him closely. "You understand what you have done," she said. Kale simply nodded. He knew the duel had changed everything. It had won him her protection, but also painted a target on his back. Enemies of the throne now saw him as an obstacle, and allies questioned why a human, a supposed primitive, was being kept so close to their ruler. Outside the palace, the streets buzzed with talk of the fight. Merchants argued over whether Kale's victory had been skill or chance. Soldiers replayed every movement, trying to understand his technique. In taverns, the tale grew larger, painting him as a warrior from a death world where every day was a battle for survival. The legend began to grow faster than the truth could contain it, but Mirok was not idle. In the dark halls of the outer districts, he gathered those who hated the Empress's rule. He promised them a return to the old ways, rule by strength, alone, without mercy or compromise. And at the heart of his promise was the vow to crush the human who had shamed him before the Empire. His voice carried the weight of revenge, and his followers listened. Within the palace, the Empress called her most trusted advisors. Some urged her to send Kale away, to remove the danger he represented. Others suggested using him as a weapon, sending him into battles where his skills could serve the throne. She listened but made no decision that day. Instead, she ordered Kale to train under her personal guard, to learn the ways of their weapons and tactics. Kale accepted without question. Each morning he trained with soldiers who had once mocked him. At first they treated him with open hostility, trying to break him with exhaustion and pain, but he endured. Day by day, they began to see that his strength was not only in his body, but in his will. He adapted to their fighting styles while keeping the unpredictable movements that had won him the duel. The Empress often watched these sessions from the balcony above the training yard. She saw how he moved, how he read his opponents as if every twitch of muscle told a story. It was a skill even her finest warriors struggled to match. She began to see him not just as a protector, but as someone who could change the balance of power within the Empire. One evening, as the sun set beyond the palace walls, Kale was summoned to her private garden. The air was heavy with the scent of alien flowers, and the sound of water echoed through the stone paths. She stood by the fountain, her red hair catching the fading light. "You stood for me when you had nothing to gain," she said. "Why?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because loyalty means nothing if it breaks when tested." She did not reply at once, but her eyes softened. Far beyond the palace, in the depths of space, Mirok's fleet began to gather. His defeat in the arena had not ended his ambition, it had ignited it. He would not return for another duel. This time, he would come with fire and steel, and the first target would be the human who had dared to touch the heart of the Zarynth throne. The nights in the Zarynth capital were never silent. Even in the deepest hours, the hum of the city echoed through the palace walls. Kale often found himself awake, listening, learning the rhythm of a place so different from his home. He knew danger was coming. Mirok's silence was not surrender. It was preparation. The Empress began moving her most loyal forces into defensive positions. She told the court it was routine, but everyone knew the truth. War was coming, and this time it would not be decided in an arena. Kale watched the preparations closely. The weapons, the troop movements, the tension in every face. He had seen the signs before. Back on Earth, in the days before battle, training grew harder. The Empress insisted Kale fight against multiple opponents, pushing his limits. The palace guards, once eager to see him fail, now treated him as an equal in the yard. They began to understand that he was not here for glory, but for something far more. Dangerous loyalty without condition. In the war room, maps of the Empire glowed with shifting lights, marking fleets and strongholds. Advisors argued over whether to strike first or wait for Mirok to make his move. The Empress listened but kept her own counsel. She knew Mirok too well. He would not attack where they expected. He would aim for the heart. Kale was summoned one night to the Empress's private study. She stood by the large star map, her fingers tracing the edge of the capital's defense line. "When he comes," she said, "he will come for you first." Kale did not flinch. "Then let him come," he replied. She studied him for a long moment before turning back to the map. "You speak as if you cannot lose." "I can lose," Kale said. "But I won't if you're standing behind me." Outside the palace, rumors swirled like smoke. Some claimed the Empress was in love with her human champion. Others whispered she had bound him with some kind of oath. Neither was true, but the gossip spread quickly. Mirak's spies carried those whispers back to him, feeding his rage and making the coming conflict even more personal. The first strike came without warning. A supply convoy bound for the capital was destroyed, its escort ships left burning. In space, survivors spoke of Mirak's fleet moving faster and with more precision than they thought possible. The Empress ordered the city on high alert. Kale prepared his weapons, sharpening the edges and checking every detail as if his life depended on it. Because it did. In the days that followed, the palace became a fortress. Barricades were raised, and anti-ship batteries were brought out. Of storage. The Empress walked the halls with Kale at her side, inspecting every defense. She noticed how the soldiers stood straighter when he passed, how their eyes followed him with something close to respect. His presence had become more than symbolic. It was a rallying point. Late one evening, as Kale returned from the training yard, a messenger intercepted him. The man's hands trembled as he delivered the news. A small outpost on the edge of the capital's defense grid had gone silent. No transmissions. No distress calls. The Empress ordered a scout team to investigate, but Kale requested to go with them. She hesitated, then agreed. If Mirak was testing their defenses, she wanted someone she trusted at the scene. The journey to the outpost was tense. The corridors were dark, the air still. Kale moved first, his eyes scanning every shadow. The soldiers followed, weapons ready. They found no bodies, no signs of struggle, only the eerie emptiness of a place abandoned in haste. In the command center, a single console still glowed. It displayed a message written in the Zarynth language, but the soldiers stepped back as Kale approached. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning, and it was meant for him alone. The console's glow bathed Kale's face in cold light. The message was short, but every word carried a promise of violence. "I will take her from you. And when you fall, I will make her watch." Kale stared at it for several seconds before turning away. This was no longer about the throne. Mirak's target was as clear as his hatred. The soldiers waited for orders, their eyes shifting between Kale and the ominous message. He ordered them to wipe the system and shut down all remaining power. The outpost was compromised, and leaving it operational would only serve the enemy. As they prepared to leave, Kale felt a shift in the air, a faint vibration in the walls. Somewhere beyond the edge of the sector, something large was moving. By the time they returned to the capital, the Empress was waiting in the war room. She listened without interrupting as Kale recounted what they had found. Her jaw tightened at the mention of the message. "He is making it personal," she said. Kale met her gaze and nodded. "Then so am I." She studied him for a moment longer before dismissing the other officers, leaving only the two of them in the room. "You are not of my people," she said quietly. "You do not owe me this fight." Kale's reply came without hesitation. "Maybe not, but I chose to stand for you, and I don't walk away from choices." The Empress's eyes softened for a brief second before she straightened again. "Then we prepare. Not for defense this time, we strike first." The next days were consumed by planning. Scouts mapped Mirak's fleet movements while engineers worked to upgrade the palace defenses. Weapons shipments arrived under heavy escort. Kale trained harder than before, sparring against the Empress's elite guard until his muscles ached and his breath came in ragged bursts. Every cut, every block, every strike was sharpened into something lethal. Rumors spread quickly that the human was preparing to lead an assault. Some in the court saw it as an insult, claiming it should be the Empress's generals at the front. Others believed it was the only way to end the threat before it consumed the empire. Kale ignored the politics. He had no interest in thrones or titles. He was here to protect one person, and that was enough. One night the Empress found him alone. In the training yard, the stars shone bright above, their cold light mixing with the glow of the torches. She stepped onto the sand without her usual guards. "You will lead the strike," she said. Kale looked at her in surprise. "Your council will fight you on that." "Let them," she answered. "They have never fought Mirek." "You have." Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the weight of the risk. The strike would be fast and precise. Mirek's fleet was vast, but parts of it were spread thin to cover his growing territory. Kale's plan was to hit a supply hub deep in his control zone, cutting off his forward forces. The Empress approved it without hesitation. She would send her finest ships with him, but the command would be his alone, on the eve of the mission. The palace felt different. The air was heavy, the corridors quieter. Soldiers moved with focus, checking weapons and armor. Kale walked the halls one last time before leaving, committing every detail to memory. He found the Empress in her garden, standing beside the fountain where they had once spoken of loyalty. "Come back," she said simply. "I will," he replied. Neither spoke again before he turned and walked away. As the fleet departed the capital, the city's lights faded into the darkness of space. Kale stood at the command deck, watching the stars slide past. Ahead lay Mirek's territory, filled with enemies and traps. But he felt no fear. His enemy had made this war personal. And Kale intended to return the favor with interest. Asterisk. Fleet cut through the void like a blade. Kale stood at the command deck, his hands gripping the railing as the stars shifted in long arcs. Every ship in formation followed his lead. The strike force was small but chosen for speed and precision. They carried enough firepower to cripple their target, but only if every move went as planned. Scouts moved ahead in silence, sending back images of Mirek's supply hub. The structure floated above a barren moon, surrounded by a ring of defense platforms. It was well guarded, but not expecting an attack from deep inside enemy space. Kale studied the patterns of patrol ships, marking weak points and possible entry vectors. Every detail mattered. One mistake could trap them here forever. The crew prepared without hesitation. Soldiers checked their weapons, engineers ran final diagnostics on engines and shields. Kale walked among them, offering short words of focus. He was not their commander by birthright, but they followed him because he had proven himself where it mattered. On the battlefield, titles meant nothing. Survival and victory were the only currencies worth anything. When the order came to begin the approach, the fleet split into two groups. The first would draw the defenders away with a direct assault. The second, led by Kale, would slip through the gap and strike the core of the hub. The plan relied on perfect timing. Kale trusted his pilots, but he trusted his own instincts more. As the enemy defenses lit up, space erupted into streams of plasma fire and flashing detonations. The decoy force moved like lightning, baiting the patrols into pursuit. Kale's ships slipped into the gap, their engines burning cold to reduce detection. The moon's surface glimmered far below, the massive supply hub growing larger with every passing second. When they reached firing range, Kale gave the command. A barrage of missiles streaked forward, smashing into the nearest defense platform. The explosion tore it apart, sending debris spiraling into the void. The rest of the fleet surged ahead, guns roaring, tearing into the hub's outer layers. Enemy ships scrambled to respond, but Kale pressed the attack before they could regroup. Boarding craft slammed into the hub's hull, cutting through with molten charges. Kale led the first wave inside, moving through corridors lit by the flashing red of alarms. Resistance was fierce, but his team pushed forward, cutting down defenders and sealing doors behind them. They were not here to capture. They were here to destroy. In the heart of the hub, Kale found the main reactor. It pulsed with energy, powering the entire station, and its surrounding defenses. His engineers planted charges along the core, each one time to detonate in sequence. The countdown began, and every second stretched like an eternity. Enemy reinforcements were closing in, their weapons' fire rattling the walls. The retreat was chaos. Kale's team fought through waves of defenders, each corridor a gauntlet of fire and steel. The first explosions rocked the hub, sending tremors through the structure. Warning klaxons blared as bulkheads sealed and lights flickered. Kale was the last to board his ship, pulling the hatch closed as the final charge detonated. From space, the destruction was absolute. The supply hub tore apart in a chain of blinding explosions, scattering molten fragments into the void. The shockwave rippled through nearby enemy ships, throwing them into disarray. The fleet regrouped quickly, falling back along their planned escape route. Behind them, Miruk's supply line burned. As they cleared the danger zone, Kale stood at the viewport, watching the distant flashes fade. This victory would not end the war, but it had changed its shape. Miruk would have to pull back, regroup, and rethink his advance. And every delay brought the Empress closer to strengthening her position. Kale allowed himself one deep breath before turning back to his crew. There was still much to do, and this was only the beginning. The return to the capital was silent at first. The fleet moved like shadows across the void, every crew member aware that Miruk would now know who had struck him. Kale did not need to guess at the warlord's reaction. Pride wounded as deeply, as his supply lines would demand retaliation, and it would come soon. The Empress received them in the palace's great hall. She listened as Kale gave his report, her expression revealing nothing to the gathered court. When he finished, she dismissed the officials and walked with him through the private gardens. "You have bought us time," she said. "But he will not waste it." Kale nodded, his mind already turning toward the next move. In the days that followed, signs of Miruk's rage began to surface. Scattered attacks hit outlying colonies, not to conquer, but to send a message. Survivors told of enemy banners left burning in the streets, each marked with the symbol of a broken chain. It was a warning aimed at the Empress, and everyone knew who the chain represented. Kale increased his presence among the soldiers, training alongside them, drilling them in tactics that mixed human adaptability with Zarynth discipline. At first, they resisted, unused to his style, but soon they began to see its value. Battles were not won by strength alone. They were won by those who could change faster than the enemy could react. The Empress convened her war council daily, but the tension in the room grew sharper with each meeting. Some urged her to fortify the capital and wait for Miruk's strike. Others wanted to take the fight to him again before he could gather more forces. She listened to both sides but did not commit. Kale understood her hesitation. A wrong move now could end everything. Then came the news no one wanted to hear. A forward defense station only 2 jumps from the capital had been destroyed. No distress call had been sent. The attack was so sudden that the station's weapons never fired. Miruk's fleet was moving faster than expected, and its next destination was obvious. The capital itself was in his path. Preparations began at once. Civilian evacuation routes were opened, and the palace was reinforced with layers of defensive barriers. Anti-orbital cannons were readied on every tower. Kale oversaw the placement of ground forces, ensuring there were no gaps in the defensive lines. Every soldier knew the coming battle would decide the fate of the throne. On the eve of Miruk's approach, the city was quiet. Streets that had once been filled with trade and song now stood empty, their lights dimmed. In the palace courtyard, Kale found the Empress standing alone, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. "When the fighting begins," she said, "stay close to me." Kale shook his head. "No, you'll stay close to me." She almost smiled at that. The first sight of Miruk's fleet came as the suns were rising. Massive warships filled the horizon above the city, their black hulls blotting out the light. Sirens wailed through the capital as shields flared to life. From the command towers, orders echoed across every channel. The battle for the Zarynth throne had begun. Kale took his position on the front lines, the air around him charged with energy. As soldiers readied their weapons, overhead, the sky erupted into streams of fire as the capital's defenses met the first wave. But Kale's eyes searched for one thing amid the chaos: the flagship at the center of the enemy fleet. He knew Mirok would be there, waiting for his chance to strike where it mattered most. The first wave of Mirok's attack hit the city like a storm. Energy blasts tore through the skies as Zarynth cannons answered with volleys of fire. Shields shimmered against the impact, holding for now but straining under the relentless assault. Kale moved among the lines, directing squads to reinforce weak points. The soldiers followed his commands without hesitation. In the chaos, trust had replaced doubt. Above them, the enemy fleet shifted. The flagship broke formation, moving slowly toward the palace. It was no subtle maneuver. Mirok was making his intention clear. He wanted the throne, and he would take it in full view of the capital. Kale ordered the anti-ship batteries to concentrate. Fire on the flagship, but it pressed on, shrugging off the impacts like a predator ignoring smaller prey. Inside the palace, the Empress stood with her personal guard, watching the battle unfold on the tactical displays. Her eyes never left the flagship's image. She knew what Mirok's arrival meant. He would come down himself, not just to claim the throne, but to make an example of her in front of her people. And he would expect Kale to stand in his way when the enemy landing craft broke through the defenses. Kale was already moving to intercept. His path took him through streets choked with smoke and debris. Every step was met with the sounds of battle shouts, weapons fire, the roar of engines. But his focus never wavered. Somewhere ahead, Mirok was closing in on the palace gates. They met in the shadow of the great steps leading to the throne hall. Mirok's armor was heavier than before, his blade larger, his presence radiating fury. "You should have died in the arena," he growled. Kale raised his weapon, his voice steady. "You should have stayed there." The soldiers on both sides fell back, leaving the two men alone as space cleared by fear and respect. The duel began with a clash of steel and energy. Mirok's strikes were crushing, meant to break Kale's guard with sheer force. Kale absorbed the blows, redirecting them, using the warlord's weight against him. Every movement was precise, each step calculated. Mirok grew angrier with every miss, his attacks faster but sloppier. Kale was waiting for that mistake. It came when Mirok overreached, his blade driving into the stone steps. In that heartbeat, Kale struck, slamming his shoulder into the warlord's chest and driving his blade into a gap in the armor. Mirok staggered, his roar echoing across the courtyard. The watching soldiers held their breath, knowing the next move would decide the fight. With a final surge, Kale ripped the blade free and sent Mirok crashing to the ground. The warlord's weapon clattered across the stones. Silence fell over the battlefield. Kale stood above his defeated enemy, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Mirok's eyes met his, still burning with defiance, but his body could no longer rise. Kale turned and looked toward the palace. The Empress stood at the top of the steps, her gaze locked on him. Slowly she descended, stopping beside Mirok's fallen form. "The challenge is over," she said to the assembled forces. "The throne is secure. And this human is no one's pet. He is the Empire's champion." Her voice carried across the courtyard, unshaken and final. The enemy forces began to withdraw, their will to fight broken with their leader's defeat. As the capital's defenders raised their banners in victory, Kale stepped aside, allowing the Empress to ascend the steps once more. She paused at the top, glancing back at him. In her eyes was something deeper than gratitude, a recognition of the bond they now shared. The war had been for the throne, but the victory belonged to them both.